There is a particular sound a prison gate makes when it opens for the last time. I did not know this until the morning of the 14th of March, when I stood outside HMP Northgate with my mother's cold hand crushed inside mine, waiting to hear it. My name is Eleanor Hartley. Everyone has always called me Ellie. I was 11 years old when they took my brother away in handcuffs, and I am 31 now, and in between those two numbers lies a story I have never told anyone the whole way through, not my husband, not my closest friend, not even myself, in the quiet hour before sleep, because some stories you keep folded up small, like a letter you're afraid to read again. But I'm going to tell it now. All of it. Even the part I'm most ashamed of. Because my brother, Thomas Hartley, spent 20 years of his one and only life in a cell for a murder he did not commit, and if I don't say his name loudly enough, somewhere, then what was the point of any of it, the waiting, the visiting orders, the silence, the whole ruined shape of our family? So let me begin where it actually began. Not at the gate. Long before that we lived in a stone-terraced house on Fenwick Row, in a small market town in the Yorkshire Dales, the kind of house where you could hear every conversation through the walls whether you wanted to or not. My father, Edward Hartley, ran Hartley and Sons, a small but well-regarded antiques and auction business that had been in the family 3 generations. My mother, Margaret, Peggy to everyone who knew her, made the best Victoria sponge in the parish, or so people said, though I suspect they mostly said it to be invited round again. Tom was 12 years older than me, the boy my parents had almost given up hope of having, and then I came along years later as something of a surprise. He used to call me Duchess, because even as a small child I ordered everyone about the house as though I owned the deed to it. He was the one who taught me to ride my bicycle, holding the saddle and running alongside me down the lane, shouting, "Don't look at me, Ellie, look where you're going." I fell more times than I can count. He never once let me see him tired of catching me. He was 23 that year, working for Richard Winslow, the most prosperous man in our town. He owned the big auction house on the high street, half the surrounding farmland, and a considerable fortune besides. Mr. Winslow had no son of his own, only a nephew, Richard, who had grown up practically under his roof but had never, I think, quite earned the trust that Tom had managed to earn in barely 3 years. Tom was being groomed, quietly, to take on real responsibility in the business, more than Richard had ever been given in 10. I understood none of this at the time. I understood only that my brother came home smelling of dust and old varnish, that he brought me sherbet lemons from the newsagents, that he was courting a lovely girl called Sophie Carrington, Mr. Winslow's goddaughter, and that our house, for one golden season, seemed to overflow with a happiness I assumed would simply go on forever. Then, on a Tuesday night in October, Charles Winslow was found dead in the study of his own house, struck on the head with a heavy bronze figure from his mantelpiece, his safe cleared of cash and 2 ledgers missing. I remember the police coming to our door that night. I remember my mother's voice climbing high and thin, like a wire pulled too tight. I remember my father standing in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, saying, "There's some mistake, officer, my son was here, he was home, was he, Mr. Hartley?" said the detective, a heavy-set man called Draycott with a mustache that seemed to move independently of the rest of his face. "Because we've a witness who says otherwise. We've his shirt, with blood on the cuff. His fingerprints on the safe." I did not understand fingerprints. I did not understand blood on a cuff. I understood only that 2 officers took my brother, who had taught me to ride a bicycle, and put handcuffs on him, and he looked back once, just once, at me standing at the top of the stairs in my nightdress, and said, "Ellie, go back to bed. This is a mistake. I'll be home before you're awake." He was not home before I woke. He was not home for 20 years. I have pieced the rest together from what I overheard as a child, from what my mother told me in fragments over the years, and from what the solicitors eventually laid out plainly, decades after it mattered most. The case against Tom looked, on paper, devastating. His shirt, genuinely his, genuinely stained, was found stuffed behind a crate in the storeroom he managed. His fingerprints were on the safe, which was hardly suspicious in itself, since he opened it most days in the ordinary course of business. And there was a witness, old Albert Cole, the Winslow house's caretaker, who swore under oath that he'd seen Tom leaving the house that night, walking fast, head down. My brother said, again and again, to the police, in the dock, to anyone who would listen, that he had been at the storeroom that evening reconciling the week's sale accounts, that he'd left before 9, that he had walked straight home, and never gone near the house at all that night. Nobody believed him. Not the jury. Not, eventually, most of our own relatives, who began to murmur that perhaps the boy had grown greedy, that love for Sophie and impatience for a future of his own had pushed him to something terrible. Only 3 people never once doubted him, my mother, my father, and me, though I was a child, and my belief counted for nothing in any courtroom. There was a solicitor, a young and not especially well-known man called Alistair Pemberton, who took Tom's case for almost nothing because my father had helped his family once, years before, during a difficult winter. Mr. Pemberton argued that the shirt could have been planted, that fingerprints on a safe a man opened daily proved nothing, that Albert Cole's eyesight was famously poor and that he hadn't had his spectacles with him that night. He argued it well. He argued it with everything he had. It made no difference. The 2 missing ledgers were never recovered. The trial dragged on for the better part of a year. And at the end of it, the jury, swayed, my father always believed, by a prosecution far better resourced than our defense, convicted Thomas Hartley of the murder of Charles Winslow. The judge gave him life. I remember the day of the verdict. I remember my mother collapsing in the corridor outside the courtroom, and a court usher I'd never met before helping me hold her up, because I was too small to manage it alone. I remember Richard, standing near the back of the public gallery in a dark, well-cut suit, his face arranged into an expression of grief so careful, so precisely correct, that even then, at 11 years old, something in me did not trust it. I did not know why. I would not understand why for 19 more years. Grief does not simply live in a person. It moves into the walls. After the verdict, our house on Fenwick Row changed shape without a single wall being moved. My father stopped whistling while he polished the furniture in his workshop, a habit I hadn't even noticed until it vanished. My mother's Victoria sponge stopped being requested, because we stopped being invited anywhere. A family with a son doing life for murder was not a family people wanted at their garden parties. Sophie's family broke the engagement within 2 months. I don't blame her for it now, though at 11 I hated her fiercely, and scratched her name off an old photograph with my thumbnail. I understand now that a young woman told her fiancé was a murderer had very few doors left open to her, and closing one quietly was, in its own small cruel way, the least destructive choice she had. My father aged in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar. He sold the auction house within 3 years. Trade had simply dried up, the way water finds a new channel when the old one is blocked, and took a much smaller job restoring furniture for other dealers. I used to sit at the back of his workshop doing my homework on an upturned tea chest, and I remember the particular texture of my father's silences. You could tell the difference between the one where he was thinking about Tom and the one where he was simply tired. My mother visited the prison every second Sunday without fail for 20 years. Not through illness, not through my own school examinations, not even the year she broke her ankle and had to be half-carried the last 100 yards by our neighbor's grown son, because she flatly refused to send anyone in her place. I went with her most times, once I was old enough. The prison was 3 hours away by train and bus. We left before dawn, carrying whatever Tom liked that year in a tin. His taste shifted slowly, the way a person's tastes do when their whole world has narrowed to one room and one exercise yard and 1 hour of visitation a fortnight. The Tom I visited was not the Tom who'd taught me to ride a bicycle. That boy's face slowly rearranged itself into a man's, thin, watchful, careful, eyes that had learned to give nothing away to anyone, because in that place, giving something away was how you got hurt. But he never once, in 20 years, failed to smile the moment he saw me at the visits table. Not once. Duchess, he'd say, every single time, even when I was 25 and married with a child of my own. Look at the state of you. Ruling the whole world now, are you? Only my own house, Tom. The world can wait its turn. And he'd laugh, a real laugh, not a performed one, and for 1 hour, twice a month, across a formica table in a room that smelled of instant coffee and disinfectant, my brother would be, for 60 minutes, exactly the person he had always been underneath everything they had done to him. I grew up faster than most girls on our street, I think, because grief makes children into small adults whether anyone intends it or not. By 16 I understood exactly what a life sentence meant in practice, exactly how the parole system worked, exactly how many years Tom would likely serve before he was even eligible to apply. I understood the name of every appeal we'd lodged and every appeal that had been quietly, wearily refused. Mr. Pemberton, no longer young by then, his own hair going gray alongside my father's, never stopped filing them, year after year, sometimes with a genuinely fresh argument, sometimes simply to keep the file breathing, to keep our name in front of a system that would gladly have forgotten us entirely. Every few years, he told me once, when I was about 20, sitting in his cramped office with case files stacked to the ceiling like a second set of walls, a case like this needs new blood. New evidence, a new witness, something. Otherwise the file just sleeps. And a sleeping file means a man stays inside. Then let's wake it up, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, the way adults look at children who've suddenly said something not at all childish. You sound like your brother, he said. Different words. Same fire. I read social work at university, chose it, I think, without quite admitting to myself why, though everyone around me could probably see it plainly enough. I began volunteering, and later working, for a charity that supported families of wrongly convicted prisoners. It was, in its way, 20 years of searching for my brother's freedom disguised as a career. My father did not live to see the end of it. He died when I was 26, his heart simply grown too tired, I think, of carrying what it carried. His last coherent sentence to me, in the hospital, was not about himself. Ellie, he said, his hand shaking in mine, don't let them forget your brother's innocent. Even when I'm not here to say it. You say it. Say it loud enough for both of us. I promised him I would. I did not know, then, that the person who could finally end our search was hiding in plain sight the whole time, at every family Christmas, every wedding, every funeral we still, out of some stubborn habit of blood, continued to attend together, sitting across the room from us, offering condolences with a face arranged into exactly the correct amount of sorrow. Richard. The break came, as these things so often do in real life rather than on the telly, not through some dramatic courtroom discovery but through an old man dying slowly in a hospice and wanting, before he went, to be clean. Albert Cole, the caretaker whose evidence had put my brother away, had grown very old. His eyesight, poor even at the time of the murder, had by then failed almost entirely. He'd retired from the Winslow family's employ some years before and gone to live with his daughter in Ripon. I had never once, in all our years fighting the case, thought to seek him out. Why would I? As far as I understood it, he was simply a mistaken old man who'd seen a shape in bad light and called it my brother. I was wrong about that. He had not been mistaken. He'd been paid. It was Mr. Pemberton's junior colleague, a sharp young solicitor called Sanel Whitfield, who had taken over much of the legwork in his later years, who tracked Albert Cole down after hearing, through the strange, small grapevine that connects even distant towns, that he'd been telling his daughter, in his final illness, that he couldn't die with that boy's face on his conscience. I went with Sanaa to Ripon myself. I remember the room, plain, whitewashed, smelling of lavender and old age. Albert Cole lay propped on pillows by the window, his eyes clouded almost entirely white with untreated cataracts, his hands trembling on the counterpane. "You're Edward Hartley's girl," he said, before I'd even spoken. His voice was a whisper worn thin by illness. "You've his look about you." I heard him once, years back, outside the courthouse, shouting that his boy was innocent. I've not forgotten that voice in 20 years. "Mr. Cole," I said, kneeling by the bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it, "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Whatever it is. Please." He was quiet a long while. Then, in that same thin whisper, "I didn't see your brother that night." I couldn't see much of anything by then. Everyone in that house knew my eyes were going, that's why nobody minded I sat at the gate instead of walking the grounds. I saw a shape, near the side door. Tall. That's all. Tall, like your brother, yes. But also tall like, he stopped. His hands twisted the sheet. "Like who, Mr. Cole?" I said, and I don't think I have ever wanted an answer to a question more badly in my whole life. "Richard came to me the next morning," he said, "before the police, before anyone. Gave me money, not a small amount, more than I earned in 2 years, and said, 'You saw Tom that night, didn't you, Albert?' Tall lad, walking fast, near the side door. Said it like he was reminding me of something I'd forgotten, not telling me something new. I was frightened. Old, poor, a daughter to see settled. I said yes. I've said yes for 20 years. I could not speak. Sanaa, beside me, had gone quite still, her pen frozen over her notebook. "I'm dying, love," Albert Cole said. "I don't want to carry this into my grave. Write it down. Whatever it costs me, write it down." He signed a statement that afternoon, the handwriting so shaky it barely resembled his name, but a signature nonetheless, witnessed by a hospice nurse, Sanaa, and a solicitor commissioner we called in urgently before he could change his mind, or before death could change it for him. Richard Winslow had bribed the only eyewitness against my brother. Once you pull one thread, an entire garment can come apart, if you pull hard enough and don't stop. With Albert Cole's statement in hand, Mr. Pemberton, 71 by then, but sharper that season than I'd seen him in a decade, applied to the Criminal Cases Review Commission to have the conviction reconsidered on the grounds of tainted testimony. It was not instant. Nothing in our courts is ever instant. But it was a crack, and a crack, once it exists, cannot be argued back into solid stone. The fresh investigation turned up what should have been found the first time, if anyone had cared to look properly 20 years before. The 2 missing ledgers from Charles Winslow's safe, never located, surfaced in a forgotten storage box in Richard's own house, when his estranged wife, in the middle of a very ugly and very public divorce, handed them over to the police herself, along with a bundle of old letters that made it clear Richard had known for some time about serious debts his uncle intended to write him out of the will over. The ledgers showed Richard had been quietly siphoning money from his uncle's business for years, money that, had Charles Winslow discovered it while alive, would have ended not only Richard's inheritance but very possibly his liberty. My brother, sharp and honest, rapidly becoming Mr. Winslow's most trusted man, had begun asking questions about certain discrepancies in the very stockroom accounts he managed, questions that, we now understood, had made Richard deeply, dangerously afraid. It was not a stranger who murdered Charles Winslow that October night. It was his own nephew, protecting a theft, silencing a man about to be trusted with everything Richard believed should have been his, and pinning it, with cold and careful precision, on the one man whose ruin would solve two problems at once. It removed the honest employee asking awkward questions, and it removed, quite conveniently, my brother's claim on a young woman Richard himself, it turned out, had wanted for years. I remember reading the fresh investigation report at 2 in the morning at my mother's kitchen table, my hands shaking so badly I had to set the pages down twice. My mother sat across from me in her dressing gown, saying nothing, simply watching my face, because she had learned, over 20 years, to read bad news and good news in the exact same silence before I could get the words out. "Mum," I finally said. "It's him. It was always him." She did not cry. I think she'd used up every tear she had for that particular grief long ago, and what remained in her was something harder and quieter and, in its own way, more frightening, a kind of stillness that comes only after you have waited so long for a thing that you no longer quite trust it when it finally arrives. 20 years, she said, very softly. 20 years he sat at my table at Christmas while that lad ate his dinner in a cell. It took another 8 months for the Court of Appeal to formally quash Tom's conviction, for a warrant to be issued for Richard's arrest, and for my brother's release to be processed. 8 months of paperwork, of hearings, of my mother sitting on hard benches with her rosary of worry beads moving constantly through her fingers, of Mr. Pemberton arguing with an energy that seemed to defy his own age entirely. And then, on the 14th of March, we stood outside HMP Northgate, my mother and I, along with my husband James, my 6-year-old daughter Alice, who had never once met her uncle outside a visits table, and Mr. Pemberton himself, leaning now on a cane but standing straight nonetheless, as though the moment demanded it. The gate made that particular sound I mentioned before, heavy, metal on metal, a groan and then a clang, and it swung open, and for one impossible second nothing happened at all, and I thought, absurdly, that perhaps this too was some cruel administrative delay, that he would not actually come. And then he stepped through. My brother at 43 did not look like my brother at 23. His hair had gone gray at the temples. There were lines on his face no 23-year-old should ever have to earn. He wore the plain jumper and trousers he'd been given for release, carrying a single holdall that, I'd learn later, contained every possession he'd accumulated in 20 years, a few paperbacks, a battered radio, a photograph of our father that Mr. Pemberton had smuggled in for him years before, and a small tin box. He stopped, just past the gate, and looked at us, and for a moment none of us moved, as if we'd all, together, forgotten how. Then my mother made a sound I had never heard her make before, not a sob, not quite a cry, something in between, something that had clearly been building for 20 years and had finally found its way out, and she crossed the distance between them faster than I'd seen her move in a decade, and my brother folded around her the way a man folds around the one solid thing in an earthquake. "Mum," he said, into her hair, and his voice broke on the single word. "I'm home." "My boy," she kept saying, over and over, patting his back, his shoulders, his face, as though she needed to confirm with her own hands that he was real and whole and truly standing there. My boys come home. I stood back for a moment, watching, my own eyes blurred, and then he lifted his head over our mother's shoulder and found me, and his face did something I will never forget. It cracked open into that old, real smile, the bicycle teaching smile, the smile that had survived 20 years of a place designed to take smiles away from people. "Duchess," he said, his voice thick. "You've gone and got old on me. You've gone and got gray on me," I said, laughing and crying at once, which is a strange and exhausting thing for a face to do, and then I was in his arms too, my mother still holding one side of him, and it was the first time in 20 years the three of us had stood together without a formica table or a 3-hour journey between us. Alice, my daughter, hung back shyly, holding James's hand, watching this stranger who was apparently her uncle with wide, uncertain eyes. Tom noticed her over our shoulders and gently disentangled himself, crouching to her height. "You must be Alice," he said softly. "Your mum wrote to me about you every single month. I know you like strawberry laces and you don't like sprouts and you once put a worm in your teacher's Wellington boot." Alice's eyes went enormous. "That was a secret," she said, scandalized, and Tom laughed, actually laughed, out loud, a sound I realized I hadn't heard uninterrupted by a visiting room clock in 2 decades, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight since I was 11 years old finally began to loosen. Word travels fast in a small town, faster still when the word is this dramatic. By the time we brought Tom home to the smaller house we'd moved into after selling the one on Fenwick Row, half the street seemed to have gathered outside, and by evening my mother's back garden was fuller than it had been in 20 years. Relatives who had quietly distanced themselves during the trial arrived now bearing bottles of wine and effusive greetings, and I watched my brother receive every single one of them with a grace I'm not certain I could have managed in his place. My mother had barely slept, cooking through the night, a Victoria sponge, of course, and a proper Sunday roast, and the trifle she used to make every Christmas before the trial swallowed our Christmases whole. "Tom," I said to him quietly at one point, pulling him aside into the small back room where he'd now sleep, "you don't have to smile at all of them. Nobody would blame you." He looked at me for a long moment, something old and tired moving behind his eyes. "Ellie," he said, "I spent 20 years learning that anger changes nothing in a locked room. I'm done being angry at people who couldn't help me. I'm saving whatever anger I've got left for the one person who could have ended this in a week, and chose 20 years instead." I didn't fully understand what he meant until later that same evening. Because Richard came. I don't know, to this day, whether it was arrogance, or a desperate need to appear innocent in front of the family, or simply the old habit of a man who'd spent 20 years performing grief so convincingly he no longer knew how to stop. But Richard Winslow walked into my mother's back garden that evening, immaculately dressed, carrying a bottle of good claret, his face arranged into that same careful sorrow I remembered from the public gallery when I was 11. He did not yet know Albert Cole's confession existed. He did not yet know the ledgers had surfaced. As far as Richard understood, my brother's release was simply an unexpected quashing on a technicality, an unlucky break for a man he still believed the world saw as guilty. "Tom," he said, arms open, voice warm, "thank God. Finally. This family's waited so long for this day." I watched my brother's face very carefully in that moment, and I understood, then, exactly what 20 years in prison teaches a man about mastering his own expression. Tom's face gave away nothing at all. "Richard," he said. "Come. Sit down." My mother's hands, I noticed, had gone very still around the plate she was holding. Mr. Pemberton, standing near the garden gate in conversation with an old family friend, caught my eye across the crowd and gave the smallest, most deliberate nod. The plan, if it could be called a plan, hastily assembled in whispered conversation an hour earlier between Mr. Pemberton, my mother, and myself, was simple. Don't confront him here, in front of half the street, where he might slip away in the confusion. Let him sit. Let him relax. Let him believe, for one more hour, his secret was safe. The police, quietly informed by Sanaa that afternoon of the reopened warrant, were already on their way. Richard sat with us for nearly 40 minutes, and I have rarely in my life watched a performance so thorough or so ultimately doomed. He spoke of putting the past behind us as a family. He offered, with what I can only describe as breathtaking cheek, to help Tom get back on his feet in the trade, perhaps even a small position at the auction house again, for old time's sake, for Uncle Charles's memory. He said his uncle's name, the man he'd murdered with his own hands, with a tremor so convincing that, had I not known the truth sitting like a stone in my chest, I might almost have believed his grief was real. My brother let him talk. He nodded in the right places. He accepted a glass of the claret. And I understood, watching this, that this too was a kind of strength I'd never fully appreciated in him before, not the strength of a man forgiving, but of a man patient enough to let a guilty conscience dig its own grave in front of witnesses. It was Alice, of all people, who cracked the moment wide open, in the innocent and devastating way only children manage. "Uncle Richard," she said, looking up from where she'd been playing near my feet, "why did Grandma Peggy's friend say your name so many times on the phone?" He said it like this, and she did, with the exaggerated seriousness of a 6-year-old imitating an adult, Richard Winslow. "Warrant. Albert Cole." Over and over. The garden did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a held breath goes silent, a beat too late, a beat too aware of itself. Richard's face, I will remember this until I die, did something extraordinary in that half-second. The careful grief simply fell away, like a mask coming unglued at the edges, and underneath it was something colder, something calculating, something that had been there, I now understood, for 20 years, hiding behind every condolence and every Christmas greeting he had ever offered our family. "What nonsense is the child talking?" he said, too quickly, his voice pitched half a note too high. Mr. Pemberton stepped forward from the garden gate, leaning on his cane, and his voice, when it came, was quiet and utterly without mercy. "Albert Cole signed a confession 3 weeks ago, Richard. Before a solicitor commissioner. Before he died." A ripple went through the gathered relatives. Several of them had known Albert Cole's name for 20 years as the man whose evidence had convicted Tom, and to hear it invoked now, in this new and terrible context, visibly shook them. "The ledgers your wife handed over match the discrepancies in your uncle's accounts to the last penny. The fresh investigation was completed last week. The warrant for your arrest was issued this morning." This is a family gathering," Richard said, standing so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the garden paving. "You do this here? Now? In front of everyone?" "You did it to my brother in front of a jury," I said. My own voice surprised me, how steady it was, after everything. "In front of a public gallery full of strangers, when he was 23 and had done nothing except ask questions about missing money you were stealing. You don't get to lecture this family about where and when it's appropriate to speak the truth." My mother rose from her seat then, and crossed the garden slowly, and stood directly in front of the man whose casual, well-tailored cruelty had cost her 20 years of her only son's youth, 20 years of her husband's slow decline, 20 years of every ordinary joy a mother is supposed to be allowed to watch, a wedding, grandchildren, the simple daily noise of a grown son coming home for tea. "I fed you at my table, Richard," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. "Every Christmas. Every family funeral, you sat with us and cried with us, and the whole time you knew. You knew, and you let my husband die not knowing his son would ever be free. You let me visit a prison every second Sunday for 20 years while you sat in your uncle's house, in the wealth you murdered him for. Richard's eyes darted around the garden, toward the gate, toward the crowd of relatives now standing between him and any easy exit, toward Tom, who had risen from his own seat and now stood very still, very quiet, watching him with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Tom," Richard said, and his voice had changed entirely now, all warmth gone, replaced by something desperate and low. "We can talk. Just the two of us." "This doesn't need to. 20 years, Richard," my brother said, and it was the first time he'd spoken since the truth broke open across the garden. His voice was not loud. "It didn't need to be. I sat in a cell the size of a box room for 20 years, and I never once, not for a single day, believed my own family would let me be forgotten there forever. I believed that, even when it felt impossible, even on my worst nights. But you sat across from my mother at Christmas dinner for 2 decades, watching her cry over an empty chair, and you said nothing. You let an old man carry your guilt on his conscience until he was dying and couldn't bear it anymore. You let my father go to his grave still fighting to clear my name. He took a single step closer. I'm not going to hit you," Tom said quietly, "though every part of me that spent 20 years in that room wants to. I'm going to let the law do to you exactly what it did to me for 2 decades on your lie. And I'm going to watch." The police arrived 12 minutes later, blue lights announcing themselves down the narrow street before the cars had even reached the gate, and Richard Winslow, who had once stood at the back of a public gallery with a face arranged into perfect, false grief, was led out of my mother's garden in handcuffs, past the very relatives he'd smiled at across 100 family dinners, while my daughter, who had unknowingly begun the unraveling of a 20-year lie with one innocent overheard sentence, hid her face in my cardigan, frightened by the shouting she didn't understand. I would like to tell you the story ends there, cleanly, with the villain led away and justice fully restored, the way it happens in the films Alice likes to watch on Sunday afternoons. But real life doesn't close its books so neatly. Richard's trial took another 18 months. He was, in the end, convicted of murder, of the original frame-up, of perverting the course of justice, of the theft that had started the entire tragedy. He is, as I write this, serving his sentence in the very same prison where my brother spent 20 years, and I confess there is a part of me, not a part one am proud of, that finds a certain grim justice in that particular geography. But no verdict, however just, hands back 20 years. It did not hand back my father, who died 2 years before he could see his son walk free, still fighting with whatever strength remained in his tired heart. It did not hand back Tom's youth, the years he should have spent building a career, marrying, becoming a father himself, growing old slowly and ordinarily the way the rest of us are permitted to. It did not hand back my mother's health, worn thin by 2 decades of grief carried mostly in silence, or the particular unclenched ease of a childhood I might have had I not spent mine learning legal terms and train timetables to a distant prison instead of playing out on the street with the other children. Sophie, I should say, came to see Tom once, several months after his release, now married with children of her own, graying at the temples the same as him. I don't know exactly what passed between them in that conversation, held quietly in my mother's small sitting room while the rest of us waited outside, giving them privacy. My brother never told me the details, and I never asked. What I do know is that when she left, both of them were crying, and both of them seemed, in some small way, lighter for it, as though 20 years of an unfinished sentence between 2 people had finally, at long last, found its full stop. Tom didn't, in the end, want to go back into the trade, or the family business, or any part of the world that had cost him so much. He works now with Mr. Pemberton's firm, not as a solicitor. He laughs at the very idea. At 43, Ellie, some things it's too late to start, but as something like a support officer, sitting with families of the wrongly imprisoned, telling them, in a voice that has earned every word of it, that hope is not naive, that files can be woken from their sleep, that 20 years is a very long time, but it is not, in the end, the same thing as forever. Alice is 12 now. She still remembers, though only in fragments, the garden, the shouting, the strange, sudden departure of a man she'd until then only known as a smiling great-uncle. She asked me once, not long ago, doing her homework at our kitchen table, whether Uncle Tom was ever cross that she was the one who'd accidentally exposed Richard. "He says I'm the best 6-year-old detective in the whole of Yorkshire," she told me, delighted with herself. "Am I though, Mum? Was I really clever?" "You were honest," I told her, "and I meant it with my whole heart. That's worth more than clever, most days. I visit my brother most Sundays now, not across a formica table, not after a 3-hour journey time to a visiting order, but simply by walking down the road to the small flat he shares with our mother, who refused, after everything, to live anywhere her son wasn't also living. We drink tea on a small balcony that catches the evening light, and sometimes he still calls me Duchess, and sometimes he tells me, in the unhurried voice of a man who has learned exactly how much time actually matters, small things, a joke he remembers from years back, a plan to visit the seaside properly one day, because in 43 years he has never once seen the sea, and he says he'd like to, before he's too old to properly enjoy it. "I lost 20 years, Ellie," he told me once, watching the sun go down over the rooftops, his tea gone cold in his hands. "I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen, or that I've simply forgiven the world for it and moved on as though nothing was taken from me. But I'm also not going to spend whatever years I've got left mourning the ones I haven't. That would be letting Richard take a second 20 years off me. I won't give him that. I think of my father often, in these quiet evenings, of his hand shaking in mine in that hospital room, his last coherent words a plea to keep saying his son was innocent, even after he himself was gone. I said it, Dad. I kept saying it, for years, in courtrooms and hospital wards and small hushed offices piled high with case files, until the world finally had no choice left but to listen. My brother is home. It took 20 years, a dying man's guilty conscience, an estranged wife's box of old ledgers, and one honest 6-year-old girl repeating a phone call she was never meant to overhear, but he is home, and he sits on a small balcony in the evening light, drinking tea gone cold, dreaming, at 43, of seeing the sea for the very first time. Some winters last longer than others. But even the longest winter, I have learned, eventually ends.